Maybe we can start with the executive summary from the report. There's a bunch of kind of data points that you put, and it's summarized with Web3 developers at an all-time high and growing faster than ever. There's 18,000 or more monthly active developers that commit code in open source crypto and Web3 projects, and there was 34,000 new developers that committed code in 2021, which is the highest in history. Obviously, the developers in the crypto industry are an all-time high and activities at an all-time high. How does that compare to like other industries that are non-crypto? Is that a big number? Is the rate of growth here a big number? Or is this just, no, in this specific sector, it's big, but we're still pretty small compared to, other types of technology verticals?
It's kind of both. So one, just from a methodology perspective, the thing to think about here is this is, in our opinion, probably a big undercounting of what's happening because we're looking only at open source repos of things that are actually published to GitHub and GitLab. But if you compare it to, the number of people that are software developers, like in the US, which is in the millions, or if you compare it to the number of people who write JavaScript globally, that's like tens of millions of people. These are really small numbers. And so I think it's actually a little of both, right? On the one hand, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 people can do a lot of damage. You can have, world-changing software that gets produced by a few tens of thousands of people. On the other hand, I think we're still very early. If you play this out 10 years and you keep growing 70 to 100% a year, you'll have millions of people here eventually. And so kind of both statements are true, I think.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think not only about kind of snapshot in time where we are, but the growth rate and trying to understand, again, humans are really, really bad at understanding the exponential growth for something like this.
If you think about like one of the fundamental things that the human brain is really bad at is exponential growth. It's like why we have this COVID problem, right? It's just like and that's why like startup investing is hard. Is just like you take this stuff and you extrapolate for 5 or 7 years and that number gets really large. And it has been, if you look at that shape, that curve, it's really impressive how that growth is compounding, right? And so I think it's a really, really important point. It's like this is why you get this whole, that trope. I think it's a Bill Gates quote of people underestimate what's possible in 10 years, but they overestimate what's possible in 2 years. And I think it's a side effect of exponential growth. So I think that's a really important point that you just made, that like the exponential growth here, if it keeps going, it actually ends up being really meaningful in 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, one of the things I think a lot about in this whole industry, right? So Bitcoin, kind of crypto, Web3, whatever you want to kind of slice it, is it's all market expanding technologies, right? And I always use the examples of obviously like an Uber or an Airbnb. If you just evaluated, well, how big's the taxi industry? How big is, hotel industry? You missed majority of what the actual value ended up being. There's a lot of people who don't own cars now and they just use Uber. And so to some degree, this industry and these technologies are doing a very similar type of market expansion. You can almost like add a zero to the number of developers that are going to be needed compared to some of these older industries. Maybe that's correct or not correct from an actual number, but like at least directionally, there should be many, many more if it works and becomes kind of what you, I, and many other people think. Is that kind of a fair way to evaluate it?
When you go back and you talk to people that were involved with like Uber's Series A, the conversation people were having at the time was, well, hey, you're raising all this money, but can you really be more than a $1 billion or a couple $1 billion company? I mean, the entire taxi industry is only $12 billion. So how could you possibly be an IPO caliber company? And your point is exactly right. What ended up happening was not only did the market grow, it grew by 10x. And so, I think the learning there is when you put an app on somebody's phone and there are 3 billion devices in the world, like all of a sudden your total addressable market goes way up. Mm-hmm. And so actually you can hit these what seem like really large numbers, with kind of the market share that we have today. And so I think that's where you look at things like, Bitcoin, and obviously this is not financial advice, but the sort of comparison people make is digital gold, right? So they say, okay, this is gold. Gold could be worth 10 trillion, but I do think one of the lessons from the internet is that these markets end up being, when you put them on a mobile device and anybody in the world can get them, the markets often end up being bigger. And so then I think that has sort of two interesting observations on the developer side. One, it actually takes far fewer developers to get to these really, really large markets than you might expect, right? So Uber only needed a few thousand people to become a $100 billion company. You rewind 40 or 50 years, and it just wouldn't have been possible, right? So like the compounding that you get from software and the composability that you get means that you can have a smaller number of people have a bigger impact. And so the leverage you're getting with software is just, keeps compounding. So, it may be that you actually never need more than 20,000 developers to have something that's bigger than digital gold. I mean, you look at Bitcoin in the report, it's only 300-ish, 260, I think, monthly active developers on open source Bitcoin. And that's remarkable, right? If you had a 260 person company that was supporting $1 trillion market cap, like that's unheard of, right? That's amazing. And so I think there's actually this thing here where you don't need that many developers to support really, really large market caps. And on the flip side, to your point, if it turns out that the market cap ends up being way bigger than anybody expected of this whole industry, when you add all these things up, that also means you can support a lot more developers than people may have previously thought. And so I think both things end up being true. Like you actually don't need that many people to support really, really massive outcomes from a startup investor perspective. And at the same time, if those outcomes happen, you end up creating this whole industry that supports way more developers than people would have originally expected.
We have one of the charts, the Bitcoin kind of developers by month joined. And one of the things that struck me here was if we look at the largest ecosystems, so let's take Bitcoin and Ethereum as kind of the two largest ones. Bitcoin has about 100 new devs per month coming in. Not all of them are retained. But when I first saw this, I was kind of looking through the report and I was like, oh, that's like a bigger number than I would have thought it was in terms of 100. But ultimately, your point about there still only being, let's call it 250 to 300, directionally, kind of active, retained developers tells me that a lot of people come in, they start building some stuff, and then they move to other areas in the kind of developer ecosystem. But still 100 per month is like a relatively big number. Is that how you kind of read both the people coming in on a month-by-month basis, but then also how we get to only 250 to 300 or so developers working on Bitcoin in an open source way over like multiple months or years?
Yeah, I think it's a couple things going on there. One, I think contributing in the Bitcoin ecosystem is just a little bit more involved than, there's a lot of legacy code there. It's a pretty robust system. Making changes by design in Bitcoin is hard, right? You don't want this thing changing underneath you all the time. And so, the sort of ramp up to actually getting code shipped in the ecosystem and making it useful is much higher than it is in other places where like if you look at something like Ethereum or Solana, like the pace of development is much, much faster by design, right? They're in a different stage of their evolution. And sort of philosophically, I think what Bitcoin's trying to do is something different, right? I think your read is basically right. Now, what's interesting is this is not counting, in some sense, I think Bitcoin sort of suffers a little bit from the methodology that we use here, which is we're only counting all the open source stuff, right? So this is not, for example, counting all the people working on all of the exchanges all over the world that integrate Bitcoin. And obviously Bitcoin is like the base pair that every exchange in the world integrates, right? You don't have a crypto exchange that doesn't have Bitcoin involved. And so in some sense, this is undercounting like the broader Bitcoin ecosystem. This is just sort of counting, in some sense, core developers that are contributing open source to the open source community.